In occultism, more than in any other science, there's a sharp division between those who know and those who do not know. In other sciences, indirect knowledge can, to a certain extent, take the place of direct knowledge. But in occultism, indirect knowledge can in no way replace direct knowledge. Therefore, though occultism is an important science, the spread of theoretical information can have little importance. Without first-hand experience of occult realities, acquaintance through others with occult facts has no value. They remain more or less in the same category as descriptions of unseen lands or works of fancy. Occultism as an art. Occultism as a science may be considered to be more or less on the same footing as other sciences, but occultism as an art stands by itself. Even the spread of purely theoretical information about occult facts may be attended with mischief, since it may arouse curiosity and stimulate the desire for acquiring control over unknown forces for selfish ends. There is nothing spiritual about occult power as such. Like any other earthly powers or scientific inventions, it is capable of being used for good or bad ends. It gives immense scope for cooperative work on the higher planes. But this necessarily implies spiritual preparedness for special responsibility. The misuse of occult powers. The novice may seek occult powers, and within certain limits, even succeed in acquiring them. But this will prove to be a curse rather than a blessing if he is not spiritually prepared for the fulfillment of the responsibility involved in the acquisition of these powers. Even the slightest misuse of occult power has severe reaction and creates a binding for the soul. Sometimes it may retard the progress of the aspirant and may even lead to a considerable setback. And apart from the spiritual ruin that the novice may invite upon himself, he may be a source of harm to others against whom he has succeeded in gaining so formidable an advantage. In the hands of the masters of spiritual wisdom, occult power is not only safe, but has immense capacity for being harnessed in the service of humanity. But it is repeated, even they are sparing and economical in its use. By its very nature, occultism as an art has its own limitations. It cannot be widely used for the material needs of humanity or for helping men in their earthly purposes. The introduction of the uncertain and incalculable factor, which the exercise of occult power involves, may create much confusion and disturbance in the ordinary pursuits of men, who must be left to their own limitations, resources, and possibilities for the working out of the law of karma. The use of occult power, therefore, has to be restricted to the furtherance of spiritual purposes. The saints sometimes fulfill the earthly desires of their devotees. This is not done because they are interested in earthly affairs, but because they desire to wean their devotees from material desires. Worldly people are so immersed in material desires that nothing interests them unless it has direct bearing upon the fulfillment of those desires. Though they may come to saints and serve them with the expectation of being helped in these matters. When a person approaches a saint with respect, it becomes the duty of the saint to help him spiritually. But when the person has some other motive, even when, I'll say that again, when a person approaches a saint with respect, it becomes the duty of the saint to help him spiritually, even when the person has some other motive. The saint, with his understanding of the human mind, may decide to help the person materially so that he may be won to spirituality. But such action for spiritual purposes is an exception rather than a rule, and dangerous for the recipient, so that the saints discourage people from approaching them for material advantage. Occult powers used to promote purification of humanity. Occultism as an art derives its justification from its use for spiritual purposes. Any diversion of occult power from this end is a misuse. Its function is in securing the purification of the human heart. As an art, occultism is relevant and necessary to those who are about to unfold their latent psychic powers, or who are already possessed of psychic powers, but are not fully alive to the material world, owing to the withdrawal of their consciousness to the higher planes. They have to be spoken to in a language they can understand. Many advanced aspirants develop occult powers, but are often as much in need of spiritual help as ordinary humanity. Since they are in possession of occult powers, they can be helped by the masters irrespective of distance. When the master's help can be consciously received on the higher planes, it becomes more fruitful than the help given through the physical medium.
Thank you, Rosalie. Ernie, could you unmute? Let's go to you because you have an appointment.
Coming down. One of the characteristics of advanced aspirants is to become so much established in happiness that they are reluctant to work in the physical sphere. This must not be confused with the return to normal consciousness after the seventh plane experience, which is the state of God realization of perfect ones, The master's return after realization is actuated by altruistic motives and is the result of Purdom, which they utilize for the spiritual uplift of humanity in accordance with the authority with which they are invested. Muhammad placed himself after God realization in the 7th plane, Buddha in the 5th, and Munuddin Shisti of Ajmer in the 5th planes, respectively. The coming down of advanced aspirants is with a view to accelerating their forward movement on the path when they find themselves held up between the planes. For example, should an aspirant get held between the 3rd and 4th planes, a master may bring him down to the 3rd plane prior to raising him to the 4th plane. Such coming down from their high station for the sake of others is often necessary in the interest of those who have not entered the path. The master may decide to get spiritual work done through an advanced aspirant and may require him to postpone his efforts for individual advancement. Such coming down eventually turns out to be a spiritual preparation for traversing the next stage of the path smoothly and quickly. Even so, the aspirant may find it difficult to renounce the advantages of attainment for the purpose of helping others. Coming down is particularly difficult for a person on the 5th plane, where the soul has sighted the infinite and has illumination. In Sufism, this state is known as Harat. In this state, the aspirant finds it extremely difficult to keep away from illumination. Yet it may be necessary that he should resist getting lost in illumination and come down for the sake of others in the world. The master has his own way of dealing with an advanced aspirant and can bring him to acceptance of any such action. The story of Ganjay Shakar. This is illustrated in the story of a famous wali whose tomb at Ajmer is a well-known place of pilgrimage. He could not close his eyes, which were always open, and he would not eat. He was on the 5th plane. His master, the Khwaja of Amir, wanted him to keep away from attachment to illumination and come down, but he found it difficult to obey. Then the master turned the key and brought him round in the following manner. He inwardly inspired 5 thieves to sit within 5 spaces from this wali and to share what they had stolen. Soon they began quarreling with each other, and 2 killed the other 3. The 2 then divided the loot between them and ran away. But in running away, they passed by the wali, who, as soon as they came near, got normal consciousness. The vicinity of these criminals was a sufficiently crude stimulus to bring him down and to make him conscious of what was happening around him. He first saw some sparrows, and his impulse was to try his powers upon them. He said, "O sparrows, die." And the sparrows died. And then he said, "Sparrows, rise up." And they lived again. The 2 thieves who saw this were amazed and requested the wali to raise the 3 thieves whom they had killed in anger. On this, the wali addressed himself to the 3 dead thieves and said, "Rise up." But they did not rise. He was aghast at the thought that he had lost his powers, and repenting for the frivolous use of these powers, he went to his master. When he came near the master, he saw the three thieves massaging the master's feet. The wali then went back, indifferent to food or drink. He became lean and remained stationed in the same spot for 10 years until white ants began to eat his body. People came and placed near his body large quantities of sugar, which the ants ate. Since his body was always surrounded by heaps of sugar, he came to be known as Gange Shakar, or the treasury of sugar. His story shows how even the most advanced aspirants need the help of the master to proceed on the way to realization. Occultism must be distinguished from spirituality. No occult phenomena have any intrinsic value in themselves. For the value that seems to belong to phenomena, occult or non-occult, is either illusory or relative. Illusory values arise when anything acquires importance because it stimulates or promises to fulfill desires and the purposes born of ignorance. If the thing is taken out of the context of these desires, it is immediately deprived of the meaning with which it seemed to be surcharged. Relative values arise when a thing acquires importance because it serves the realization or the expression of the truth. The importance of such things is derived from their being the essential conditions of the game of divine life. And though it is relative, it is real and not illusory. Most persons consciously or unconsciously attach undue importance to occult phenomena and mistake them for spirituality. For them, miracles and spirit phenomena are of absorbing interest, and this is taken to be an indication of interest in the true life of the spirit. But there is a very clear distinction between occultism, arid mysticism,
Probably
spiritualism.
and.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. But there is a very clear distinction between occultism and mysticism, spiritualism and spirituality. And any failure to grasp this difference leads to confusion. All miracles belong to the phenomenal world, which is the world of shadows. As phenomena, they are subject to change, and nothing that changes has lasting value. Realization of the eternal truth is initiation into the unchangeable being, which is the supreme reality. And no acquaintance with the occult world or capacity to manipulate its forces is equivalent to the realization of the truth. The occult phenomena are as much within the domain of false imagination as any other phenomena of the material world. The one important thing is to realize the divine life and help others to realize it by manifesting it in everyday life. To penetrate into the essence of all being and to release the fragrance of that inner attainment for the sake of the guidance and benefit of others, by expressing in the world of forms, truth, love, purity, and beauty alone has intrinsic worth. No other happenings, incidents, or attainments have importance. Reincarnation and karma, the significance of death. The worldly man identifies life with the manifestations and activities of the physical body. And for him, therefore, the beginning and end of bodily existence are also the beginning and end of a man. All this experience speaks to him about the transitoriness of the physical body, and he has witnessed the disintegration of physical bodies once vibrant with life. So he is impelled to believe that life is conterminous with bodily existence.
Thanks, Ernie. That may be coterminous, but I don't know for sure. Mahu, please.
Can we check it? I mean, that word,
As the holy man takes death to be the cessation of life, he gives great importance to death. There are a few who contemplate death for prolonged periods. Most persons, however, engrossed in worldly pursuits are impressed by incidents of death only when confronted by it in their lives. Death is among the most dreaded and most laminated events. It is
That's lamented.
Oh, I'm sorry. That makes better sense. Lamented events. It is also lamented events. It is also what people in malice or anger try to conflict upon each other as a last penalty or the worst revenge. And it is what they rely upon as the surest means of removing aggression or interference. People also invite death upon themselves in tokens of supreme self-sacrifice. And at times, they seek it with the hope of putting an end to worldly worries and problems, which they are unable to face or solve. This importance is derived from attachment to particular forms, but death may lose much of its importance even for the worldly man if he takes a broader view of life. He can realize that in spite of the transitoriness of forms, there is an unbroken continuity of life, for all forms are discarded and new ones created. Death is matched by birth. Death is matched by birth. Despite death, life continues to flourish. All generations are replaced by new. Life is incessantly renewing and refreshing itself. The stream of life is ever moving through forms like the waves of the ocean. So, even within the limits of worldly experience, there is much, page 171, there is much that mitigates the thought of death as irreparable loss. Yet a sane attitude to death is possible only if life is considered impersonally without attachment to particular forms. But this is the very thing the worldly man finds difficult. For him, one form is not as good as another. The form with which he identifies himself is by far the more important. The general preservation and advancement of the stream of life has for him no real interest. What the worldly man craves for is a continuation of his own form and of the particular forms with which he is entangled. With the vanishing of the forms that are dear to him, he becomes a victim of sorrow, though life may have elsewhere replaced lost forms with new ones. The sorrow of death turns out to be rooted in selfishness. The person who loses his beloved may know that life has elsewhere compensated for the loss, but his feeling is, what is that to me? Death becomes a cause of sorrow when a man looks at it from his personal point of view. Though from the point of view of life in general, it is an episode only. Thank you, Baba. Problems of the impersonal intellect. Impersonal considerations fortify the mind against the personal sorrow of death, but they do not by themselves solve the problems that confront the impersonal intellect of man when he considers some of the implications of death within the limits of ordinary experience. If death is to be regarded as the annihilation of individual existence, there seems to be irreparable loss, for each individual may be in a position to give to the universe something unique. And there is often the cutting short of an earthly career before its completion, all struggle towards the ideal, all enthusiasm for the great, the good, and the beautiful, and all aspiration for things divine and eternal, end in death. The implication of death as the termination of individual existence contradicts the expectations of rationalized intuition. Thus, there arises a conflict between the claims of intuition and the deliverance of the impure intellect, which assumes death to be the termination of individual existence. Such conflict is often the beginning of pure thinking, which challenges the accepted belief that death is the termination of individual existence. Death as the extinction of life can never be acceptable to the spiritual aspirations of man, and therefore the belief in the immortality, page 172, of the individual soul is often accepted without much resistance, even in the absence of direct supersensible knowledge about the existence of life after death. Those who know of immortality from personal experience are few. Supersensible knowledge of the existence of life after death is inaccessible to the vast majority of persons. For them, immortality must remain a belief, but nothing more. It becomes a part of personal knowledge for those who, through spiritual advancement, have automatically unfolded certain latent perceptual capacities of the inner vehicles of consciousness.
Thanks, Mahu. Marian.
I have to pass at this moment. I have noisy tree trimmers outside my window.
Okie dokie. 3 worlds. Immortality is possible because the individualized soul is not identical with the physical body. The individualized soul continues to exist with its sanskaras in the inner world through the medium of its mental and subtle bodies, even after it has discarded its physical body at death. For life, through the medium of the gross body, is only a section of the continuous life of the self. Other sections of its life have expression in other worlds. Nature is much more than what a man perceives through the senses of his physical body. There are hidden aspects of nature that have finer matter and forces. But there is no unbridgeable gulf separating the finer aspects of nature from its gross aspects. All interpenetrate each other and exist together. Though the finer aspects are not perceptible by ordinary men, they are nevertheless continuous with the physical aspect, which is perceptible. They are not remote, yet they are inaccessible. This is due to the fact that human consciousness functions through the physical senses, which are not adapted for perceiving those aspects of nature that are finer than the physical aspect. Ordinarily, a man is unconscious of the inner planes, just as a deaf man is unconscious of sounds. For all practical purposes, therefore, the inner planes are other worlds. The hidden elements of nature have two divisions, viz., the subtle and the mental, corresponding to the subtle and mental bodies of man. The whole of nature may therefore be divided into three parts. One, the physical or gross world, two, the subtle world, and three, the mental world. When the self has incarnated itself in a physical body, it expresses its life through each of these parts. But when it drops the outer sheath of the physical body, it continues to have its expression of life in the subtle world through the subtle body and in the mental world through the mental body. The subtitle of Untimely Death. Life in the physical body is terminated only when the sanskaras, which are released for expression in that incarnation, are worked out. Though in some exceptional cases, the soul gives up its physical body before the working out of the sanskaras. For example, the man or woman who commits suicide cuts short the period of their life and prevents the working out of sanskaras. When the sanskaras released for fructification are withheld from expression, the discarnate soul remains subject to their propelling force, even after the physical body has been discarded. The momentum of the sanskaras, which were prevented from being worked out, is retained after death, with the result that the departed spirit desires the things of the physical world. Then the discarnate soul experiences an irresistible impulsion towards the physical world and craves for physical objects, so that it seeks gratification through the physical bodies of souls that are still incarnate. Thus, the soul may want to drink wine, and finding some person in the physical world in the act of drinking wine, may satisfy its desire through that person by possessing his or her physical body and attaching himself to it. In the same way, if it wants to experience anger, it may do so through a person who is feeling angry. Such souls wait to meet and obsess some incarnate persons of similar sanskaras, and so try to maintain their contact with the gross world through others as long as possible. In life after death, any lingering entanglement with the physical world is a serious hindrance to the life of the soul, and those who are subject to this condition must be looked upon as unfortunate, since they invite upon themselves and others much unnecessary suffering. Compared with these unfortunate souls, the posthumous life of other souls is much smoother. Subtitled Death, the Interval Between Two Lives. When the physical body is dropped, normal souls reconcile themselves with the severance of connection with the physical world, acquiesce in the limitations imposed by their changed conditions, and sink into a state of subjectivity in which begins a new process of mental digestion of the experiences on earth by the revival of the sanskaras connected with them. Thus, death inaugurates a period of comparative rest, consisting in a temporary withdrawal from the physical sphere of action. It is the beginning of an interval between one incarnation and another. 2. Hell and heaven. After death, there is no consciousness of the physical world, since that consciousness is directly dependent on the physical body. But though that consciousness is lost, the impressions of the experiences of the physical world are retained in the mental body and continue to express themselves through the semi-subtle sphere. During the interval between death and the next incarnation, the consciousness is turned towards these impressions so that they are revived with the corresponding experiences. Man is not aware of the subtle environment. He is in complete subjectivity, absorbed in living through these revived impressions. States of the mind. Subtitle: In life after death, the experiences of pain and pleasure become more intense than in the earthly life. These subjective states of intensified suffering and joy are called hell and heaven. Hell and heaven are states of the mind, not places. And though from the subjective point of view, they mean much to the individualized soul, they are illusions within the illusion of the phenomenal world. In the hell state, as well as in the heaven state, desires become more intense, since they no longer require to be expressed through the physical medium, and their fulfillment or non-fulfillment also becomes intensified. In the earthly career, desires as well as the pleasures and the sufferings they bring are experienced through the physical body, though the self uses its higher bodies even in its earthly career. But in that career, consciousness is bound up with the physical body, and therefore the process of consciousness has to pass through an additional veil and gets lessened in force, liveliness, and intensity. Just as rays of light get dimmed when passing through glass. During the habitation of the body, desires and experiences suffer deterioration. But when the bodily habitation is given up, they undergo increase of intensity. In the heaven state, the fulfillment of desires is not, as in the physical sphere, dependent upon the object of desire. Fulfillment of desire comes through thinking. For example, if a person is desirous of hearing music, he gets the pleasure of hearing it merely by thinking about it. The imaginative idea of music is a substitute for the physical sound vibrations. The pleasure the soul derives from the thought of music is much greater than the pleasure derived in its earthly career from the physical sounds. In the heaven state, there are no obstacles between desires and their fulfillment. And the pleasure of self-fulfillment through thought or feeling is constant. Marion, is it quiet where you are now?
Yes. Even in the earthly sphere, some persons develop the capacity of making their pleasures independent of physical objects. The deaf Beethoven could, through the exercise of imagination, enjoy his own compositions. So even on earth, he may have been said to be in the heaven state. Thus, one who meditates on the beloved derives happiness through the thought of the beloved, without requiring the physical presence. After death, in the heaven state, imaginative fulfillment is greater because consciousness is then disburdened of the veil of the physical body. Some desires have a direct relation to the possession of the physical objects through the physical body. Lust, gluttony, and the craving for wine are of this type. In these desires, there are not only the sensations derived from contact, but the response of the body itself. These desires are the hell state. In contrast with the finer desires, the coarser desires are dependent upon sensation, apart from any intellectual meaning or aesthetic or moral value. In the finer desires, such as the desire for music, there is an element of sense contact with the physical sounds. But these sounds in themselves express beauty. In the same way, a desire to hear speech exists not only because of the sound of the words, but because of their intellectual meaning and emotional appeal. Almost the entire significance of experiences brought about by the fulfillment or non-fulfillment of what are here called coarser desires is by the bodily sensations themselves. They can rarely, like the finer desires, yield the experience of fulfillment through the exercise of thought and imagination. It is characteristic of the coarser desires to long for the possession and assimilation of the physical object. The imaginative idea of the physical object accentuates that urge. Since the physical object of the coarser desires is not available in the subtle world, there arises an intensified experience from the suffering of non-fulfillment. The revived experiences in connection with the coarser desires are the sufferings of the hell state. The sufferings of hell and the pleasures of heaven. Just as in this world, the presence of coarser desires leads to the balance of suffering over pleasure, in the life after death, also, the revived experiences lead to a balance of suffering over pleasure, thus bringing into existence the hell state. And just as in this world, the presence of finer desires leads to a balance of pleasure over suffering, in the life after death, too, the revived experiences lead to a balance of pleasure over suffering, thus bringing into existence the heaven state. But hell and heaven are both states of bondage, subject to the limitations of the opposites of pleasure and pain. Both are states whose duration is determined by the nature, amount, and intensity of accumulated impressions. Time in the subtle world is not the same as time in the physical world, owing to the increased subjectivity of consciousness. But it is nonetheless determined by the impressions accumulated in the physical world. However, the important fact is that the hell state and the heaven state are not lasting. After they have served their purpose, both come to an end. Reliving experiences. The coarser sensual desires, such as lust, and their emotional products, such as hate and anger, contribute to the life of delusion and suffering in the hell state. And the finer desires, such as idealistic aspirations, aesthetic and scientific interests, or goodwill towards others, and their emotional products, such as personal love or fellow feeling, contribute to the life of enlightenment and pleasure in the heaven state. These states, for most persons, consist in reliving the experiences of earthly life by means of the verification of the impressions left by those experiences, and their duration and nature are dependent upon those experiences through which the person passed during his life in the physical body. Heaven and hell would, however, serve no purpose if they were but merely the revival of the earthly past. That would mean bare repetition of what has once occurred. In these afterlife states, consciousness makes a more effective survey of the record of earthly life through the intensification of experiences.
So that's in these after death states. Though I guess it means the same in these afterlife states.
In these after death states, consciousness makes a more effective survey of the record of earthly life through the intensification of experiences. On earth, the consciousness of most persons is mainly objective and often dull, and under the pressure of unspent sanskaras, is mostly concerned with the possible fulfillment of sanskaras through the present or the future. But after death, the consciousness of most persons is predominantly subjective and retrospective. And in the absence of forward-goading sanskaras, is mostly preoccupied with reviewing and assessing the significance of the past. Immediate responses to the changing situations of earthly life are replaced by a state free from the urgency of immediate action. And the accumulated experiences of the earthly career is available for reflection. The recording of earthly life has been taken on the film of the mind, and it is now time to study earthly life through the magnified projections of the filmed record on the screen of the subjective consciousness. Thus, the hell state and the heaven state become instrumental for the assimilation of experience acquired in the earthly phase, so that the individualized soul can start its next incarnation in the physical body with the advantage of digested experience. The lessons learned through such reflection are by the power of their magnified suffering or happiness confirmed on the mind body, and become for the next incarnation part of the intuitive makeup of the active consciousness. The truths absorbed by the mind in the life after death become in the next incarnation a part of inborn wisdom. Developed intuition is nothing but consolidated understanding distilled through the multitude of experiences gathered in previous lives. Different souls start with different degrees of intuitive wisdom, which is their initial capital for the adventures of their earthly career. This intuition is to be looked upon as an unfoldment of what was latent in the self. Thus, the experiences of earthly life, as well as the reflective and consolidatory processes to which they are subjected in life after death, are both instrumental in releasing the intuitive wisdom latent from the beginning of creation. As with the earthly career and experiences, the states of hell and heaven in the life after death are incidents of the journey of the self, which is meant to arrive ultimately at the source of all things, the eternal self.
Thanks, Marion. We'll stop here and start next time at the memories of past lives, and that's the top of page 178.